One, take one.
So what are the major trends in the international oil market during recent years?
I think you could say, Mr. Sippel, that 1970 was a real watershed in the international oil business. It was the year when it became very clear that the industrialized consuming countries, Europe and Japan, had a very heavy and perhaps vulnerable dependence on the Middle East and African oil-producing countries. To take the figures for Europe, the imports in 1970 were of the order of 500 million tons of oil, and that was about 60% of the total energy requirement of Europe, which is a very heavy dependence on a single source.
But what could you do in order not to get so dependent on one source? Or what are you doing?
Of course, it's not just a matter of what the oil industry or of what one particular company is doing. These are national problems affecting the national economy. One obvious answer is to try and diversify the sources of oil and gas and look and explore for these in other parts of the world. And we would hope that governments would encourage this, because looking elsewhere in the more difficult parts of the world tends to be more expensive than the traditional oil we have found in the past. Another answer must be diversification of energy sources away from oil and gas to look for alternative sources, of which for Europe the most important would be nuclear energy.
But what about the oil findings in the North Sea, and for instance the oil findings in Alaska? And also there have been talk about oil findings outside Vietnam. Which effect will this have?
I think you can take Vietnam, let's dismiss right away. There has been no drilling even in Vietnam, so there is no question of oil findings there. In Indonesian waters there have been interesting findings, but it's a very small proportion.
Two, take one.
Do you think prices will increase further during the coming years?
In 1972, you mean, the year
72,
to come?
73.
You know, if I were able to estimate the future of prices very, very well, I would be a very rich man, which I'm not. But we don't dictate prices, as you'll understand. In a competitive society, and with the number of marketers that there are, including in Denmark, prices are dictated by competitive situations, which include many factors. The first factor, of course, is that we do have a security of oil cost from the OPEC countries, or at least we hope so. We have a 5-year agreement. The second factor is that freight can change. It depends usually now on political happenings, like pipelines being damaged, rather than on normal commercial factors. But freights are rather low now, so it's unlikely that prices would fall because freights fall. And the third thing is inflation in the consuming country itself. Inflation has been quite worrying, and we've had to put up prices partly because of that. I think that most governments now are determined to try and control inflation, and with some success.
You spoke about damaged pipelines, but also a new pipeline is being built in Egypt now. Which effect will that have on European prices? Will it have any effect at all?
This is the Suez Mediterranean pipeline built by the Egyptian government, SUMED pipeline we call it. The tariff for using that pipeline is fixed by the Egyptian authorities at such a price that it equates to the normal use of tankers going around the Cape of Good Hope. And therefore, in the long run, it should have no economic effect. There's no doubt in a short term it can have, depending on whether freights are high or low at that time. The building of the pipeline should tend to keep freights down and therefore avoid sudden increase in costs. It should somewhat help to stabilize the situation, but it does not mean that oil will become suddenly cheaper, because if that were to happen, it means they've put the tariff too low, and they won't do that.
But speaking about Egypt, how much will a reopening of the Suez Canal affect prices?
It's just the same situation. There will be a tariff for using the Suez Canal, and if they set that tariff right, it will be equivalent to big tankers going around the Cape of Good Hope. So it should have a stabilizing effect, but no long-term effect on costs.
Right now there's quite a lot of talk about OPEC countries participating in the oil companies. What is the attitude of Shell towards participation?
This is, of course, a very important issue, and one that is right on top of us at this moment. So far, all we know is what we have read in the press and what the representatives of individual OPEC countries have privately told us. We have not seen the official resolution because it has not been published.
Why have the majors lost market shares during recent years? I'm thinking on the international level.
You're not talking about Denmark itself.
No, international.
In the international level, it is of course true. I think the main reason is because of the influence of government-sponsored companies who are given special advantages, if you like. National companies in France, for instance, in Italy, given special advantages so as to gain market share. That is the main reason. It is also true that small independent companies who can work on a very narrow margin have done well in certain circumstances. They don't always. In 1970 they did very badly, and a number of them.
There have been speculation in parts of the Danish press, I think it was based on an American oil expert, what he said, that the North Sea findings would be a new Middle Eastern adventure. What is your comment to that?
I would be very happy to know that this was going to be true. So far, there have been three important discoveries, and it could even be 5 discoveries. Let's say about 1 million barrels a day. The production of the Middle East and African countries is now close to 20 million barrels a day. So you see there's a very big gap.
Okay, yeah. Let's take one.
Why have the majors lost market shares during recent years?
You mean in Denmark?
No, I mean on the international level.
It is true, certainly, that the major companies have lost appreciably over the last 10 years. I think mostly because of the influence of government-sponsored companies, that is, national companies in France, Italy, etc., where, as a matter of government policy, they have helped those companies to gain market share. There has also been some loss to the completely independent private company who operates in a different way. He deals with very small margins with a small part of the business, and he can afford to take advantage of situations then which we're too big to do, I suppose, and that we have too much backup, too much research to be able to afford that sort of business. In times of trouble, as we had in 1970, then these companies find themselves at a great disadvantage, and they often have to sell out to the major companies. In other words, the oil industry could not be based on the principles of those independent companies.
What do you think is the major problems facing the international oil market, and especially the big or the major oil companies in the future?
That's a very wide question, Mr. Sippel. Let me say, I think, first of all, security of supply. In other words, we have to find a system of coming to a lasting balance of agreement with the OPEC countries who have the great majority of the world's oil reserves. We also have to find a system of not depending 100% on them, but having some alternatives as well. The next big problem for every industry, but especially for the oil industry, is cash flow into the future. Inflation has bitten into the cash flow. Looking for oil in new places becomes more and more expensive and will require more cash flow. Raising money on the world's money markets becomes more and more difficult. That's the second. And I would say the third is living with the environment. Man has become so rich and so technologically demanding that he is in danger of ruining his own environment. And yet at the same time we know that taking the corrective action so as not to ruin your environment is quite expensive on resources. We have calculated, for instance, that taking the lead out of gasoline and lowering the sulfur content of fuel oil increases the demand for crude oil by 3%, because it's a more costly operation. You have to do a lot to get the sulfur out. So effectively, by making these demands on his environment, man is requiring more of these resources and therefore depends even more on the OPEC countries. These, I would say offhand, are three of the major problems that we face.
My last question is,